Greetings, this is Greg. The Macchi C.200 flew more combat sorties than any other Italian fighter in World War II. They fought in the Mediterranean theater, over North Africa, and on the Eastern Front. It was named the Saetta, which means Thunderbolt, obviously not to be confused with the US Thunderbolt or the Thunderbolt from Mitsubishi. This was a popular name. I'll be calling it the C.200. The C.200 has some desirable characteristics and unique features, but overall, it was the wrong type of fighter for World War II. It wasn't fast enough to realistically catch up to US bombers, and it didn't have enough firepower to do much to them if it did. That said, in a 1 versus 1 against an Allied fighter, it could present a real challenge, and it did have some limited success in combat. Let's take a look at the design. An immediately out-of-place feature for a World War II fighter is the open cockpit. Normally, when you see a World War II fighter that went into combat with an open cockpit, it was usually a plane designed in the early 1930s and totally obsolete by the start of World War II in Europe. But that's not the case here. The C-200 is a contemporary of the Hurricane, Spitfire, and 109. In fact, all of those planes predate the C-200 in service. The Curtiss P-40 and the C-200 entered service the same year. The Italian fighter, like the others I just mentioned, was designed and initially built with a closed cockpit. However, the Italian pilots didn't like that. They wanted an open cockpit, and it was changed. Open cockpits lasted longer in combat aircraft than they probably should have. German ace Gunter Rahl said that there was an aversion to closed cockpits in part because it would prevent pilots from smelling the engine. As crazy as that sounds, an overheating engine, or one that's burning an excessive amount of oil, does smell a certain way, and in the days before accurate gauges, that could be a factor in detecting an engine problem before it got out of hand and caused a forced landing. If you've ever overheated a car, you probably know what I'm talking about. Gunter Rahl started flying in the late 1930s, so that coincides with the development and introduction of the C-200. Pilots also felt it was important to be able to feel the wind and hear the sounds of the wind over the airframe to have full control and full mastery of the aircraft. Both of these problems, meaning engine issues and feeling the wind, were compensated for in closed cockpit airplanes by use of good gauges and instruments, but it took a little while for pilots to adapt to the new way of doing things, apparently especially in Italy. There were additional advantages to open cockpits too. For example, if engine or exhaust fumes were leaking into the cockpit, they would be less likely to overcome the pilot. And that was actually a real problem, especially in Soviet fighters, and that was one reason the Soviet pilots often flew with their sliding canopies in the open position. Another was that some canopies were hard or impossible to open above certain speeds, preventing a bailout. Of course, the canopies themselves inhibit visibility a little, especially if the material isn't perfectly transparent, and it never is. So that was thought of as a problem too. Engine reliability was not that great back in the 1930s, and a single-engine airplane, an off-airport landing as the result of an engine failure, was not statistically unlikely. Today, of course, most pilots can expect to go an entire career without an engine failure, but that was not the case back then, and the ability to get out of a crashed airplane was a consideration favoring the open cockpit design. When we look back at World War II, an open cockpit fighter in 1939 seems pretty crazy, let alone in the 1940s. But looking at it from the point of view of a peacetime fighter pilot flying in Italy, mostly in good weather in a Mediterranean climate, an open cockpit does seem like a reasonable choice. It wasn't the right choice, but without the benefit of hindsight, it seemed reasonable at the time. The Macchi C.200's engine was the Fiat A74, a 2-row 14-cylinder air-cooled radial. It displaces 1,907 cubic inches. It's pretty big, 31.25 liters, making it slightly larger than the U.S. Pratt & Whitney R1830 used in the F4F Wildcat. The engine itself is much like every other 14-cylinder air-cooled radial from World War II, but as compared to the engine in the Wildcat, the Fiat's power is relatively low, roughly 870 horsepower versus the Wildcat's 1,200. The two engines are of similar design and have exactly the same compression ratio, and are about the same size, with the Fiat engine actually the larger of the two. So what gives here? Why is that power low? Well, if you're a regular on this channel, you probably already know the answer. The Fiat engine is limited to very low manifold pressure values because it used 87 octane fuel. It also has a very simple supercharging system, a single-stage, single-speed centrifugal supercharger with no intercooling or water injection. Maximum emergency power here is 960 horsepower at 3,000 meters. That's at 2520 RPM and a manifold pressure of 890 millimeters of mercury absolute. Measuring manifold pressure this way via inches of mercury absolute is unusual. In British terms, this was 2.5 pounds of boost. In US terms, it's 35 inches of manifold pressure. In German terms, it's 1.17 ATA. So hopefully that puts this into perspective. To put this all into practical terms, or further into perspective, I suppose, the maximum manifold pressure in the C200 isn't just low, it's super low. It's about equal to the economy power settings in US radials. The plane does perform pretty well, though, with this engine, largely because it's so light. With full fuel, oil, ammo, plus a pilot and his parachute, the Series 1 version of this plane is only 2,328 kilograms, or 5,132 pounds. That makes it one of the lightest planes in the European theater, and it was certainly lighter than Spitfires, Hurricanes, or P-40s. Of course, part of the reason it's so light is because it does not have a lot of armament. For air-to-air work, almost every one of these airplanes carried only a pair of 12.7 millimeter machine guns, which were based on the U.S. Browning M1919. These were Breda Soffits. Maybe they're called Breda SAF-ATS. I'm not sure. This isn't a gun channel, so I don't really care what they were called. What matters here is that they were good guns with good ammo, but with only two of them, you needed a lot of time on target to bring down a well-armored enemy fighter like a P-40, let alone an American bomber. Regarding armor and pilot protection, most C-200s had an armored seat for the pilot, plus they had self-sealing fuel tanks from very early on. These were below the pilot, and of course the pilot had some protection from that radial engine up front. Pilot protection was not bad in this airplane, especially for standards of the time. In terms of performance, the plane's power-to-weight ratio isn't terrible, but it's not great. Let's look at some quick numbers. The power-to-weight ratio for the Macchi C200 at 960, so emergency power, is 5.35 pounds per horsepower. Of course, it can only have that 960 at a very specific altitude, about 3,000 meters. Above that, it loses power due to dropping manifold pressure, and below that, it loses power due to throttling losses. However, I'm also using the plane's fully loaded weight, and it would have burned off some fuel by then, so I think it's a fair way to look at things. So how does that 5.35 pounds per horsepower compare to the Allied contemporaries? A Hurricane Mark II-C comes in at 6.47, a Spitfire Mark II at 5.43, a Curtiss P-40D at 6.07. So the Macchi has a power-to-weight ratio advantage against those planes, and a pretty good advantage here over the Hurricane or P-40. Now that advantage is not quite as good as it seems, as the Macchi pilot will have a harder time getting all that power out of his engine because the plane doesn't have a constant speed prop. The others here do. It has a three-bladed prop with manually controlled variable pitch, much like a very early Hurricane, Spitfire, or Bf-109. But by late 1940, all of those planes had constant speed props, but the C-200 never did. What about wing loading? The Macchi does pretty well here too, 28.35 pounds per square foot. The Curtiss P-40 comes in at 31.88. The Spitfire has only 25.5 pounds per square foot, and the Hurricane is at 29.7. Of course, wing loading doesn't take everything into account. For example, it doesn't take into account the wing design, really only the size. So I think it's best to look at the stall speed of the planes to get an idea of how well the plane can support the wing's weight. The problem is that with these four airplanes, it's hard to do that accurately. The Macchi's manual, as far as I can tell, does not have any correction data for its airspeed indicator. Thus, I don't know if I need to add or subtract anything to its published 80 mile per hour stall speed. Both the Hurricane and Spitfire list stall speeds at 80 miles per hour as well, but they have large corrections that need to be factored in, and the manuals don't have data that goes down that low. For example, in the Spitfire Mark II, you need to add 7 miles per hour at 120 miles per hour, and that trend has higher corrections as the speed decreases. So that 80 mile per hour stall speed in the Spitfire is probably 87 or more, but we don't know for sure. As a side note, virtually every flight sim out there simply takes the indicated airspeed for stall performance, which hugely advantages planes with low reading airspeed indicators. In some sims, this gives the already very maneuverable Spitfire almost magical turn performance. So looking at stall speeds here isn't really rock solid because of a lack of indicated versus calibrated data. However, we do have a report from a British squadron leader, D.H. Clark. He flew a captured C-200 in mock dogfights against Spitfire 5s, Kitty Hawk 3s, and Hurricane 2s, and wrote about it in his book, What Were They Like to Fly? He said that the C-200 could outturn all of them and outclimb all except the Spitfire, and that actually lines up pretty well with the power and wing loading data we looked at earlier. We really only have secondary sources about how the plane flew. When captured Macchi C-200s were tested by the Allies, they were at a point in the war when the C-200s just didn't matter much. They were also at a point in aviation technology where a sub-1,000 horsepower fighter wasn't of much interest to anyone, and it seems that the original test reports from the Allies have been lost to time, or at least I can't find any. That said, I think we have enough in terms of specs to conclude that this plane could probably outturn and outmaneuver its Allied opponents. It also had an ace up its sleeve to further stack the cards in the Macchi's favor in a turn fight. Its ailerons would go down with the flaps, giving a lot of extra lift. The flaps are the split flap type, but they have a lot of area and could be put down in small increments that could make them useful to enhance turn performance in some situations. I don't know if the Italian pilots ever did that. I doubt they ever needed to. Maybe in some situations against a Spitfire this might have come in handy. The plane has a lot of other interesting features. Some are visible, some are not. Externally, there are two things that really stand out to me. The cowling is so tight to the engine that it has 14 teardrop bulges for the rocker covers. This is possible because the Fiat engine's rear cylinders are staggered in such a way that the rear cylinders rockers are in line with the front rockers. Thus, 28 rockers, 14 teardrop bulges. In other words, the exhaust rocker from one row lines up with the intake rockers from another. This engine layout was common, but setting the cowling up this way was not. It looks to me like it would have taken a lot of time to fabricate that cowling, and it gives the plane a fairly unique look. It should be mentioned that Fiat built a plane very similar to the Macchi C-200, which was the G50 Frisia, or Aero. Both planes use the same Fiat engine and look quite similar, but these are two different airplanes. The Macchi's cowling really gives it that unique look, making it very easy to recognize. Another externally visible feature of the Macchi is that high cockpit. The bottom of the cockpit is about even with the center line of the big radial engine, giving the pilot an excellent forward view. This helps on takeoff and landing, and there is a benefit in a dogfight. When one plane is chasing another in a turn fight, it's hard to line up the shot because when trying to pull lead, the target disappears under the nose. Often in radial engine fighters, this problem is worse because the plane's nose is relatively large. A few planes had raised cockpits to try and offset this problem, but the raised cockpit of the C-200 is especially pronounced. Other features of the plane are not as readily obvious. The C-200 has a built-in fire extinguishing system. You would think this would have been a common feature in World War II fighters, but it wasn't. It was quite rare. The plane also has an unusual system for the time to start the engine. It packed a tank of compressed air that would drive an air-driven engine starter. An air-driven starter has some advantages over the other types typically used during the period. It's light, and once the tank is discharged, it's harmless. Quite a few U.S. airplanes used electrical starters, which were heavy and required heavy batteries and wiring. In the case of the C-200 system, it has the advantage of less weight and no chance of causing an electrical fire. Macchi also used air pressure to charge the machine guns, and this system could also clear jams, which is of increased importance when you only have two machine guns to begin with. One oddity of the plane is that the throttle works backwards of just about every other airplane. Forward closes the throttle, pulling it back adds power. I don't know why they did that. The last oddity I'll mention is the dual airspeed indicators. It has two separate airspeed indicators, each with its own pitot-static system. I've never seen this in any other World War II fighter. I can only speculate as to why Macchi built the plane this way. First, it could have been for redundancy. When trying to sell the idea of a closed cockpit, I'm sure part of the pushback from pilots was the loss of the ability to perceive speed from airflow, from feeling the wind and the sounds of the open cockpit. Perhaps that second airspeed indicator was to offer assurance that if the first one failed, the pilot would still have a good idea of the airplane's airspeed. It's also possible this was for aerobatics. At some high slip angles, depending on the pitot-static system design, some airspeed indicators have huge errors in them. By running with two independent systems, the pilot would always have one that's going to indicate more correctly than the other during a slip in one direction or another. In other words, Maybe the left one works better in a left slip and vice versa. Prior to the war, the Italians did put a lot of emphasis on aerobatics, so that might have been the reason. Let's move on to performance. From the pilot's manual, its maximum speed was 503 kilometers per hour at 4,500 meters, which is about 313 miles per hour at 14,800 feet. And that's the often quoted spec. If you watch another video on this plane or you look it up in a book, odds are that's the maximum speed you're going to find. The thing is, that's not the plane's real maximum speed. It's the maximum speed without using emergency power, which was a common way to measure max speeds in level flight back then. The maximum altitude for full emergency power is only 3,000 meters at about 9,840 feet. Any higher, and the supercharger can't provide enough manifold pressure to generate the full emergency 960 horsepower. Sadly, there are no complete performance charts for this plane in the pilot's manual or anywhere else I can find. As a general rule, a plane's speed at a given altitude will increase by the cube root of the increase in horsepower. In this case, that would give about an extra 5% in top speed with emergency power, but the actual gains will be somewhat less because of the lower altitude needed to generate all that power. At a lower altitude, parasite drag is higher for a given true airspeed, partially offsetting the increase in power. The plane's top speed at emergency power was probably about 318 miles per hour at just under 10,000 feet. That's the best I can come up with here. It's still not fast by World War II fighter plane standards. I have graphed my best estimate for the plane's maximum speed here, along with a P-40E, which in British terms was the Kitty Hawk Mark 1A. We also have the Spitfire Mark 5. These are intended to be representative of 1941 levels of performance for both planes. Yes, I know there were much faster versions of both of these planes later on. Looking at climb rates, we have good data from the Macchi's pilot manual, but it doesn't give numbers for emergency power, so I'll just use what we have. At normal maximum power, it gets to 1,000 meters in 1 minute and 3 seconds. That gives us a rate of climb of 3,123 feet per minute. I'll add that to the chart. To get another 1,000 meters, it takes another 1 minute and 7 seconds for a rate of 2,939 feet per minute, and so on. These rates of climb are not bad, especially considering that this plane isn't at emergency power. It's at climb power, giving around 790 horsepower, not 960. I do think that takeoff power was used for some initial portion of that first 1,000 meters. Also note the increase in climb performance right around 4,000 meters. That's because the critical altitude for the climb power setting is right there in the 4,000 to 5,000 meter range, and throttle losses are near zero right in there. Of course, above that, it's losing manifold pressure, so power and thus climb performance suffers. I'll add in the Spitfire 5 and P-40E. These numbers are approximate, especially for the P-40E, as the USAAF report on it did not give performance at these exact altitudes, and more importantly, because this data is for a P-40E at only 1,150 horsepower. The P-40E went up to 1,470 by the time US pilots would have been facing Italian fighters in any numbers. Of course, we need to remember that below 3,000 meters, the Macchi has the ability to run at emergency power, bumping its numbers up a bit as well. The Spitfire 5 will outclimb the Macchi, although not by much in certain ranges. Now the P-40 won't outclimb the Macchi, although it's at least in the same ballpark, right around 3,000 meters. If this is the type of content you enjoy, please like and subscribe and consider joining my Patreon. Memberships there start at only $1, and you get access to various manuals and documents I use in creating these videos. You can participate in polls there that determine the direction of the channel, and of course have an easy and direct communication line with me. Back to our video. The C-200's maximum dive speed doesn't seem to be in the pilot's manual, at least I can't find it there. Numerous secondary sources say it had a maximum dive speed of 500 miles per hour. I'm not sure if that's true, nor do I know if that's indicated or calibrated. Either way, 500 miles per hour is really fast. Admittedly, there are some gaps in the information I can find on this airplane. The Spitfire 5's maximum dive speed is 450 miles per hour indicated, or 442 calibrated. The P-40's is 485 indicated, and I believe also calibrated. Assuming the Macchi's 500 mile per hour limit is correct, it can outdive either of the other two airplanes mentioned, and its advantage over the Spitfire Mark V here is significant. To sum all this up so far, as compared with the Spitfire Mark V and P-40E, the Macchi is quite a bit slower, but its maneuverability and dive performance were superior to either, and its climb performance was better than the P-40s. The Macchi's protection was decent. The later versions had an armored pilot seat along with self-sealing fuel tanks. Its protection was better than the Spitfire Mark V, but not quite as good as the P-40. The differences there being that the Spitfire had an upper fuselage fuel tank that's not self-sealing, and the P-40 had better armor protection specifically for the pilot's head. Where the Macchi is way behind the curve here is in firepower. Its two machine guns just didn't pack the punch needed to go after U.S. bombers, even if it could catch them, which was itself a problem. Against U.S. fighters, they're okay, but it is going to take a lot of time on target to bring down an airplane like a P-40. Overall, the Macchi is not quite on par with the Allied fighters, but it isn't too far behind and had some advantages. So how did it actually do in combat? By Italian standards, it was sent into combat a lot. The C-200 flew more combat sorties than any other plane flown by the Regia Aeronautica during the war. The C-200s fought over Yugoslavia in 1941 before U.S. entry into the war. They did some strafing attacks and destroyed some ground targets, seaplanes, trucks, and equipment, but as far as I can tell, never engaged an enemy fighter in air-to-air combat. Over North Africa and the Mediterranean, the C-200s did see some action. They did a lot of strafing. They covered the German retreat from El Alamein and probably at least contributed to the sinking of a British destroyer, the HMS Sick, via bombing attacks. The C-200 couldn't carry much of a bomb load, but any bomb is a problem if it hits an unarmored target. In terms of air-to-air engagements, there is very little I can find. I can literally count on one hand all the battles over North Africa and the Mediterranean I can find involving C-200s in air-to-air combat with Allied fighters. They flew a lot of missions, they just didn't encounter enemy fighters all that often. There isn't nearly enough information to figure out a kill ratio for those theaters. There was one interesting battle in which an RAF ace in a Hurricane was outturned and shot down by a C-200, which further reinforces the idea that the C-200 had really good turn performance, but that isn't really in doubt anyway. On the Eastern Front, we have quite a bit of information, with specific dates of events, squadron and pilot data included. This adds up to a 5.9 to 1 kill ratio for the C-200s versus the Soviets. Of course, there are those who will dispute that. I'm sure the commie bros will show up in the comment section and let me know all about how the stats are fake and disputed by some historian of some note in Russia. I'm sure it's likely there are some errors in these statistics, but as everyone ever has had a pretty good kill ratio against the Soviet prop-driven airplanes, I think it's likely the C-200s did as well. For now, just humor me. Let's just say that we know with 100% certainty that the C-200s had a 5.9 to 1 kill ratio overall. It still would not matter. Even if they achieved that kill ratio in every theater, it wouldn't matter. It doesn't matter because of the total numbers of aircraft involved. This is something that isn't talked about much, so I'm going to have to take a detour and explain this. We talk about kill ratios all the time, but almost never about how many planes had to be built to get those ratios to matter. For example, the P-51 Mustang famously had a kill ratio of about 11 to 1. Pretty good considering the competition they were up against. Now, how many P-51 fighter planes were built during the war? About 13,500. Now we have to ask, how many planes did they shoot down? That answer is about 5,000. Plus they destroyed many more enemy aircraft on the ground, around another 4,000 more or less. There's no need to be exact here in this example, it's the principle we're looking at. So that means that the U.S. built around 2.7 P-51 Mustangs for every enemy fighter they shot down, and about 1.5 P-51 Mustangs for every enemy fighter, or enemy aircraft in this case, destroyed by a Mustang, including ground kills. In reality, the numbers are even better for the Mustang because many were built and delivered after the Luftwaffe and Japanese Army and Naval Air Forces were weakened so much there were few enemy planes left to destroy. Of course, at that point, the Mustangs were destroying trains, rail yards, trucks, supply depots, barges, anything else they could find. The amount of enemy stuff destroyed per Mustang built was huge, and not just for the Mustang. Many of the frontline U.S. fighters have similar numbers. Back to our C-200. It probably had 88 air-to-air kills on the Eastern Front, maybe. I've read up on every Italian World War II ace I could find. This book from Osprey helped, but I can only find evidence of about 100 airplanes shot down by C-200s. But let's go crazy and say they shot down 200 Allied airplanes. That would mean they would have needed to build 5.75 C-200s for for every Allied airplane they needed to shoot down. The math here is easy. They built 1,150 of these airplanes, so if they shot down 200 aircraft, that's 1 kill per 5.75 C-200s built, way short of the P-51's number of 2.7. Could the Italians have built enough C-200s to do the job? No, because U.S. production was way too high. Do you know how rapidly the United States was able to build airplanes during World War II? Let me put this into perspective for you. On average, on any given day during 1943 and 1944, the U.S. built 248 airplanes. Again, that's every day. All the planes ever shot down by the C-200 in the entire war were probably fewer than the number of planes the U.S. built in just one day. Thus, even if the plane did have that 5.9 to 1 kill ratio against the Soviets, and I think it probably did, it just doesn't matter. Even if we bumped it up to an 11 to 1 kill ratio like the Mustang, which would have taken a literal miracle, it would still have only destroyed about 426 airplanes, not even a noticeable dent in Allied air power. In some ways, the Macchi C.200 is a bit like the Japanese airplanes, like a Ki-43 Oscar. It's more rugged and with better dive performance and better protected against enemy fire, but with the same sort of emphasis on agility. The big problem was the Italians just couldn't build many of them. It wasn't just the C-200 that they couldn't build many of. They had low production numbers across their entire aviation industry, which is a whole topic by itself. All that said, I think it's a really cool airplane. It's probably a lot of fun to fly in peacetime, and in a simulation, in a 1 versus 1, it could probably cause some real headaches for Spitfires, Hurricanes, and P-40s. However, in regards to the C-200 in actual World War II battles against the U.S. Army Air Force or the RAF, not enough speed, not enough firepower to be effective, and nowhere near enough of them. I do have the C-200 pilot manual going into the Patreon section. Please consider joining. Memberships there start at only $1, and there is a lot going on in that section. That's all for now. Goodbye, and have a great day. Well, I guess I do have a few more things to say. Of course, I realized this right as I finished the main recording. I took some of the pictures I used in this video at the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. The plane looks to be very well finished and put together with great craftsmanship. I think that's representative of the original wartime construction and not of a later restoration. The cowling is really a work of art that's very apparent when you see it up close in person. By the way, that cowling was a NACA design. As I've mentioned many times on this channel, there was a lot of sharing of aviation information, especially from the United States prior to the war. The wings were a modified NACA design and used on later fighters as well from Macchi, like the one seen in this picture from Spacer. Depending on how this video does, I might make more videos on Italian airplanes, including this one. I do really like them. On the subject of Spacer's art, this is not AI. I paid a real artist to make these images. I have links in the description for coffee mugs, Mousepad, and other items with this artwork, and they really are of great quality. I use these mugs every day, and I get very positive feedback on these. Back to that cowling. As nicely made as it is, the oil cooler scoop is so simple looking that it seems out of place on that beautiful cowling. At first, I thought it was something fitted to the plane after it was damaged somehow, but that's incorrect. That's how these planes were from the factory. It looks to me like the people designing the engine and those designing the airframe were not quite in sync, but maybe that's not it. Maybe for some reason a box is the ideal shape for the oil cooler on this airplane for some reason. But oil cooler ducts are usually more rounded and streamlined on planes from the era, and that's what I would have expected to see here. Another thing I would have expected to see is the exhaust stacks aimed at least somewhat to the rear to take advantage of the thrust benefit. On radials, that wasn't commonly done until a bit after this plane came out, but those exhaust stacks are just pointed straight down and doing essentially nothing for performance. For comparison in the way they're made, let's take a look at the pipes coming out of the supercharger. These comprise what is essentially the intake manifold. You can see the individual pipes going from the supercharger at the center of the engine radially out to each cylinder. They look really nice with beautiful curvature and appear to even be polished, which is how they appear in all the pictures of these engines. Someone at Fiat took a lot of pride in these. Now take a look at the exhaust manifolds. They're not nearly as nice. The exhaust, after exiting most of the cylinders, has to take an immediate 90-degree turn toward the exit. In the automotive industry, this is called a log-type manifold, and its entire purpose is to be easy to build, easy to package, but it's far from ideal for performance. I doubt it would have hurt horsepower much in this application because the size of the pipes and the fact that mechanically supercharged engines are less sensitive to exhaust design than others. But when you combine this with the downward pointing outlets, you have a missed opportunity to get more from the engine. In the Fiat engine manual, there are no pictures of the exhaust manifolds, often called exhaust stacks. Not one single picture of them. They have lots of pictures of everything else, including all the tools needed to service the engine, but not one of the exhaust stacks. This picture of the exhaust stacks is from the aircraft manual, which leads me to think that Fiat delivered the engine to Macchi without the exhaust manifolds, as they didn't know how it would fit into the airplane. Then Macchi, being an airframe manufacturer, didn't quite put the effort into the exhaust that they put into their airframe. Or it could be that the plane was just too far along in development at the point when the engines showed up, and they didn't have time to do much. Most Allied fighter planes improved a lot during the war. Horsepower went up almost constantly in the P-40s, Spitfires, and others. But that didn't happen with the C-200. While it may have been a little bit competitive in 1940, 1941, certainly by 1943 it was way behind the Allied fighters in capability by a pretty big margin. A big part of that was fuel. Limited to 87 octane, the Italians couldn't just keep raising manifold pressure more and more as the Allies were able to do. Thus, power in the C-200 never went up any meaningful amount. Even if they had better fuel show up at some point, the Fiat A74's supercharger wasn't a high boost design. It had straight impeller blades, which are fine at lower boost levels, and they have the advantage in being able to be used in both clockwise and counterclockwise applications, but they are not great for high boost applications. Sure, maybe with 100 octane fuel, they could have re-geared the supercharger drive and gone up to 1.35 ATA, maybe 1.4, I think 5 or 6 pounds of boost. And that would have got it up to about 1150 horsepower, and maybe they thought about doing that. But in October of 1943, Italy essentially switched sides, so any need or desire to upgrade the C-200 was completely impractical at that point. I'm not saying there were no attempts to improve the plane. There were. At one point, they fitted an extra pair of smaller caliber machine guns to the plane. They also experimented using a moderately more powerful radial engine, but that never made it into production. The big upgrade that did work was switching over to the Alfa Romeo inverted V12, which was essentially a license-built Daimler-Benz engine to create the Macchi C.202. But that's a story for another time.